Pathologists studying skeletons from Ice Age Europe to Bronze Age Pakistan kept noticing the same strange signature over and over in remains that had no connection to each other whatsoever. A specific pattern of bone damage around the jaw. Different continents, different centuries, same exact fingerprint, like a killer leaving the same mark at every crime scene across 10,000 years. At first, nobody could explain it. It didn't match any known weapon. It didn't match starvation, or plague, or violence. Whatever this was, it had been quietly killing people across the entire span of human history. And it left behind a mark specific enough that researchers eventually gave it a name in the medical literature. The culprit turned out to be something almost embarrassingly small. Not a predator. Not a war. Not even a disease in the way we usually think of one. A single infected tooth. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. This wasn't rare, and it wasn't quick. Once an infection like this took hold, a person could suffer for days, sometimes weeks, fully conscious, while it spread through their skull. There was no ambulance, no antibiotic, no emergency room. Just other people, standing over someone in agony, trying to decide whether to do something drastic or watch them die slowly. Some of them chose drastic. Imagine being inside that decision for a moment. It's the middle of the night, somewhere in Ice Age Europe. A woman hasn't slept in 3 days. Half of her face has swollen so badly, one eye is nearly shut. Her breath comes in short, careful pulls, because breathing deep hurts. Everyone around the fire knows what this usually means. They've watched it happen before, but someone in that group refuses to just wait for the end. They reach for a splinter of stone instead. That single choice, repeated in different forms by different people across thousands of years and thousands of miles, is the entire story we're about to tell. Because an abscess doesn't stay where it starts. It swells for days inside the jaw, then spreads into the soft tissue of the face and throat until swallowing, then breathing, becomes difficult. If it reaches the bloodstream, it becomes sepsis, and sepsis can kill within a week of the very first ache. There was no clean line between toothache and death sentence. It was one condition with escalating stages, and reaching the final stage was common enough to leave that same signature in bone after bone after bone. So why didn't it wipe out entire groups? Why isn't every prehistoric skeleton we find a casualty of its own mouth? Because some people fought back. And the evidence of that fight, once you actually look at it, is almost impossible to believe. In a limestone cave in northern Italy, researchers examined a jaw fragment over 14,000 years old and found a molar with a hole bored straight into it, smooth-walled, marked with tiny parallel scrape lines, like something had worked at it deliberately, again and again, with total focus. This was reparo fredian, and the hole wasn't decay. It was surgery, performed with a splinter of flint, thousands of years before anyone on Earth had a word for dentist. Picture the scene directly, because it deserves to be pictured. A fire burning low near the cave mouth. Cold air pressing in from outside. One person held down by others, jaw forced open, eyes streaming, every muscle fighting the urge to pull away. Another leaning in close, working by touch and firelight, scraping decayed tissue out of a living tooth millimeter by millimeter. There was no numbing agent, no way to stop the bleeding if something went wrong, no promise that this would help rather than make everything worse. They did it anyway. Because the alternative was watching someone they loved die slowly, and doing nothing felt worse than doing something wrong. Then the evidence took the story somewhere even stranger. Thousands of miles east, in the ancient settlement of Mehrgarh in modern-day Pakistan, archaeologists uncovered 9 adult molars, roughly 9,000 years old, each one bored through with a small, precise hole. The tool marks matched exactly the bow drills Mehrgarh craftsmen used every day to shape tiny stone beads for jewelry. Someone had taken a tool built for decoration and pointed it at the most sensitive tissue in the human body. Here's the detail that stops most people cold. Several of these patients survived. The bone had healed cleanly around the holes. This wasn't one desperate act performed once, in a panic, and never again. It was a repeated functioning practice, carried out by people who had done it enough times to get it right, on patients who lived long enough afterward for their jawbones to remember the wound closing. Somewhere in that settlement, there was very likely someone who did this again and again. Someone who other people sought out specifically, walking to a particular hut, because word had spread that this person knew how to fight the pain that killed everyone else. We don't know their name. We may never find their grave marked in any special way. But their hands are still speaking to us, 9 times over, in the bone. And the mystery deepened again, this time in Slovenia, where a jaw roughly 6,500 years old was found with a cracked molar packed carefully with beeswax, sealing the fracture from open air. It is, as far as current evidence shows, the oldest known dental filling on the planet. Someone understood, without any concept of bacteria, without a single word for infection, that sealing a wound could slow the invisible thing that was killing people from the inside. 3 cultures, no contact between them, the exact same terrifying problem, and each one, independently, invented a real working answer using nothing but the materials already in their hands. But not everyone reached for a tool. Some reached for an explanation instead. And this is where the story turns genuinely bizarre. In ancient Mesopotamia, healers believed a worm lived inside the tooth, gnawing from within, and that dental pain was the sound of it feeding. Picture a mother pressing her ear near her child's swollen cheek, imagining she can almost hear it chewing. It sounds like pure superstition, something to laugh at from where we're standing now. But the belief did something quietly useful. It gave an invisible killer a shape, and shaped enemies can be fought, prayed against, bargained with, driven out. Treatments built around expelling this imagined worm still involved real plant extracts pressed directly against the site of pain, and some of those extracts likely did reduce swelling and dull the ache, even though the entire theory behind them was wrong. Wrong explanation. Partially working treatment anyway. Sometimes that was enough to survive the week, and that's the twist almost nobody sees coming. We assume medical sophistication climbs in a straight line. Cavemen suffering blindly in the dark, each era a little smarter than the last. Modern dentistry sitting at the shining finish line of that climb. But the deepest Stone Age response we've found, in Italy and in Pakistan, was mechanical, precise, almost clinical in its confidence. Later societies, further along the timeline than these Ice Age cave dwellers, leaned harder into myth and ritual instead. Sophistication didn't rise steadily upward like a staircase. It rose and fell, disappeared and reappeared, long before anyone thought to write any of it down. Underneath all of the tools and the treatments and the theories, though, is something quieter and far more important than any of them. At Shanidar Cave, researchers studying Neanderthal remains found an older individual who had lost most of his teeth and suffered from severe joint disease, likely for years before he finally died. In a world with no soft food, no ground grain, no way to puree anything, a person who couldn't chew shouldn't have lasted long on his own. He didn't have to survive alone. Evidence suggests the people around him fed him directly, softened what he ate, kept him alive well past the point where his own body could have managed it by itself. Sit with that for a second. Somebody, every single day, for years, made the choice to keep this man fed. Not because he could still hunt, not because he could still contribute in any obvious practical way, simply because he was still there and they weren't willing to let him go. That is not the cold math of survival of the fittest. That is something we'd recognize instantly if it happened in our own family tomorrow. A toothache was never just private agony either. Inside a band of 20 or 30 people, utterly dependent on each other to survive the next season, one person in crippling pain threatened the whole group. They couldn't hunt, couldn't focus, couldn't sleep, and their suffering kept everyone else awake too, listening, afraid of what came next. So somebody had to act. Somebody had to be the one who pressed a sliver of stone against another human being's exposed nerve and pushed, knowing it might not work, knowing it might make everything worse, and doing it anyway because watching and waiting had already killed people they knew. That instinct never left us. The dread you feel at the sound of a dental drill isn't random, and it isn't purely modern. It's inherited. The echo of tens of thousands of years in which mouth pain genuinely meant your life might be ending. Every time a dentist today reaches for a drill, they are, in a very real sense, continuing an unbroken chain of effort that started with a hunter-gatherer and a splinter of flint in a freezing cave in Italy. Which brings us back to that bone signature pathologists kept finding, over and over, in skeletons with nothing else in common. Some of those people had someone nearby who tried. You can see it in the healed holes, the sealed cracks, the jaws that kept living for years after they should have failed. Others didn't have that person nearby, or the infection simply moved too fast, and their signature ends differently, frozen mid-suffering in bone that never got the chance to heal. The mark itself can't tell you which ending a person got. But it can tell you this. The difference between surviving and becoming a fragment in a museum drawer often came down to nothing more than whether another human being, in the dark, by firelight, was willing to reach into your mouth with a piece of stone and refuse to let you die quietly.